traumas. And so our clients go to great lengths to ensure that their trauma is not conscious, that they don't think about it, talk about it, feel about it. And so that is the most challenging thing about working with traumatized people, right? And the other thing about that is that we are wired the same way. We are all wired to not talk about, think about, and feel about our trauma. So in all the work that we do with people who've experienced trauma, we are kind of battling that dissociative coping strategy for dealing with trauma that's present in all of us. So you can think about a lot of trauma-focused work as simply trying to overcome that need to not talk about, think about, and feel about trauma. So we talked about how there's this dissociative trauma response in traumatic situations, and that that is true for single event traumas, and that when people have experienced lots of different kinds of trauma, what we usually refer to as complex trauma or developmental trauma, that peritraumatic trauma response that leads to dissociation becomes just the way that we function all the time. So that people who've experienced chronic trauma, whose development has been shaped by violence and attachment disruption, we'll talk a lot about that today, that they are in this survival mode all the time. And so the parts of the brain that take in information, make sense of it, put it together with our other experience, knowledge, understanding, help us to figure out what to do and make plans to act on, those parts of the brain become unavailable. So today we're going to talk a lot more about how this all works and how do we assess clients to try to get an understanding of what they've been through and how it's shaping their current functioning and how dissociative responses fit into that. All right, so I'm going to give you another chance. Any comments, questions, or anything that you thought about since part one that you'd like to start off with?
I have one question.
Yes.
Do you mind going back to the last slide? Sorry.
Not at all.
I just want to make sure I better understand the grayed out input part. I definitely understand what's going around the bend with the process, evaluate options, and plan. And so, like, is it just a thwarted take of our input, and we're interpreting that on the fast road, right?
Yeah. So really, the reason it's gray and not crossed out is because it's not that in a traumatic situation, it's not that we don't take in information, but the information we take in is limited. So essentially, our attention gets narrowed to the things that are most relevant to survival in that moment. And so this is sort of a for people who've experienced a lot of trauma, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because they're gonna interpret only things related to threat, and not take in a lot of the contextual information about that. So we're interpreting what things mean based on a partial take on what's happening that usually doesn't include much context.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Sure. Other thoughts, questions? All right. So we talked last time about how our clients often get misdiagnosed. They get all these other diagnoses because people don't know about their trauma, or they don't think about how the trauma might relate to the symptoms that they're seeing, and that there are a lot of other factors that go into the diagnoses our kids get that are more about politics and economics sometimes than they are about what's happening clinically. And for those of us who work primarily with Black and Brown children and families, though that diagnosis process for them often is also racialized. So this is some data from our clinic, the REACT Clinic, which is a trauma-informed psychological and psychiatric needs assessment clinic for anybody who's been affected by community violence. And this is a study that is right now in preparation for publication. It was done by one of the master's students in the University of Chicago Master of Arts program in the social sciences, and Allie McLagan. And she looked at all the kids who came through the REACT Clinic who had had prior mental health encounters, and looked at those prior mental health encounters and diagnoses that they were given. And she found that, first of all, they were much less likely to get a trauma or stressor-related diagnosis. And that for the diagnoses that have the strongest likelihood of harming our clients, they were much more likely to get those diagnoses. And by that, we mean chronic disorders, a bipolar, or what's now called the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. I don't know who came up with that one for the DSM-5, but has anyone ever said that since the DSM-5 was published? I don't know. I mean, I just said it in a presentation, but really, do you talk to your clients about their disruptive mood dysregulation disorders? I kind of doubt it. And then psychosis. So what you can see here is that 21% of these kids had been given a conduct disorder diagnosis in prior mental health encounters, and none of them got that diagnosis in the REACT Clinic. And you can see the same for bipolar and same for psychosis. So what she found is that in most cases, in prior encounters, the providers missed trauma that a child had experienced. And so this is based on what we know from the REACT Clinic assessment about what they've experienced. 2/3 of those kids, we identified trauma in the REACT Clinic that had not been identified in prior encounters. And the most frequently overlooked types of trauma were community violence and traumatic loss, which among the clients we take care of, these experiences are almost ubiquitous. So we have children who are carrying the burden of often multiple traumatic losses, and that those are not identified often in clinical context by the family or by the provider as relevant or something that they would want to find out about. And so the other thing that she found is that the more types of trauma someone had experienced that were overlooked in prior mental health encounters, the more likely they were to be diagnosed with a conduct disorder. And so you can see in this chart, the kids with conduct disorder had 2, 4, 5, 6, 8 different types of trauma that had been identified in the rehab clinic and missed in their prior mental health encounters. So this is just highlighting the importance of approaching everybody we work with a trauma lens. And we'll talk more about this, but the way that we approach our work is to assume that trauma is playing an important part in what's going on with them before we assume that they have some kind of mental illness. And this is the opposite of how most of us have been trained to approach clinical work. And this is particularly true in medical settings, because in medical settings, people are focused all the time on the presenting problem, the symptoms, and what diagnosis those symptoms are associated with. And so we think finding out about symptoms isn't particularly helpful if you don't have a context. So starting with what people have been through, we find is a lot more helpful to us in understanding them and to them than starting with what's your problem. And you probably have heard this phrase that being trauma informed means changing the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, which seems pretty oversimplified. Actually, I think Oprah and Bruce Perry have a book right now that's called What Happened to You. So it's this idea, or what happened to me or something. So it seems like a pretty simple idea, but it's still an extremely important idea, and one that I think we have to kind of condition ourselves from the way that in most systems that we're told we have to do things. So any comments or questions about all of that?
I had a question. Do you know how McLagan defined traumatic loss?
Yeah, so traumatic loss for us is a death of a loved one that is caused by a traumatic event.
Okay.
So it could be a violent death, that in like an intentional homicide. It could be a accidental death. Could be a sudden, unexpected death from natural causes. Any of those would be considered a traumatic loss.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, and this eventually will be published when we get around to it, essentially. Unfortunately for us, Allie went and got a job. And so, that's kind of getting in the way of her getting her paper submitted for publication, but it'll be out there and we'll let you know about that when that happens. Okay, so there are lots of different ways that we can think about trauma, and particularly for our clients, there's simple traumatic stress, which generally refers to a single event or a single type of event. So episodic trauma that can include repeated isolated events. But for many people, for many of the people you work with, people we work with, that is less likely to be their experience. And so they're more likely to have had different kinds of complicated traumatic stress. And those include complex PTSD, a clinical concept for adults with a history of prolonged childhood trauma, typically. That's Judy Herman's work. If you have not read Trauma and Recovery, that is the book to read. That's what I tell people. Everything you need to know about trauma is in that book. And complex PTSD is now a diagnosis in the ICD-11. So you can diagnose people with this finally, after many years. And it's a long, sad story about how complex PTSD was forbidden from being included in the DSM with the DSM-4 and then again in the DSM-5. But thanks to the work of Mary Len Cloytra and her colleagues in Europe, it's in the ICD-11, and we now have a diagnosis that's not PTSD for our clients, for whom that's not the best way to understand them. Another approach to this kind of complicated traumatic stress, or another type of complicated traumatic stress, is developmental trauma or developmental trauma disorder, which was first put forward by Bessel van der Kolk in 2005. It really is focused on children and adolescents and understanding how their development has been shaped by trauma and disruptions of attachment. We'll talk about that today. For many of our clients, another kind of trauma that is one of the layers in here that we need to think about is historical trauma or collective trauma. So by historical trauma, we mean massive trauma that occurs to a population of people based on their identity. So for the people we serve, the massive historical trauma of slavery is directly related to a lot of what's happening for them in the present. And people think about the Holocaust, and on this continent, the near genocide of indigenous peoples. These are the big historical traumas that are relevant for our patients. And those shape the structures of the society and all the structures in which our kids are functioning day to day. And that in turn shapes their development in ways that we have to understand, the same way we try to understand the individual isolated traumatic events.
There's also a question about
yes.
Divorce or separation of parents.
Sorry, say again.
What about divorce or separation of parents?
So we will talk a lot about attachment today. And so that, I think your question really relates to that a lot. And whether we think about disruptions in attachment relationships, including divorce and separation, as like big T trauma or little T trauma, and sometimes I don't know, that's more of an academic distinction than a meaningful clinical one. But it sort of depends on the context of those separations, divorces, and what other kinds of trauma accompany them. And so they can be traumatic in the way that we think of other single event traumas, but more likely it's the way that attachment gets disrupted, and the changes that take place in the child's attachment context that are the most problematic.
Will you also talk about involvement in the child welfare system when talking about attachment?
Yes.
Okay.
Any kind of substitute care, whether it be because the child welfare system mandated it to happen, or whether it was more voluntary, or whether it was necessitated by the death of a primary attachment figure, or any of those. All of those are hugely important in how we understand developmental trauma. And it's an important part of the diagnosis of developmental trauma disorder. And yes, so we will talk about more. And if people have questions specifically around that, certainly we can talk some about that today, and also in part 3. If you bring specific case material, that would guarantee that we would get into that. Other questions? Okay, so this other concept that's important for us in the work that we do is this idea of continuous traumatic stress. So this construct came out of South Africa, and it was an attempt to account for trauma that continues, and that there's always the realistic possibility that whatever trauma people have experienced is going to happen again. So it's the threat. It's not just the repeated episodes of violence, it's the ongoing threat of those kinds of violence. And so it's trauma is past, current, and realistically anticipated in the future, right? So with this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of the interventions that we have for post-traumatic stress disorder assume that the trauma is in the past and it's over. And they assume that children are in safe settings. But for many of the people we serve, there is no safe setting. There's always a threat. And that threats come from multiple directions. They come from other, they come from peers, they come from other people in their communities, they come from their systems that are meant to be involved in their lives. We think for protective reasons, but often these systems are built to harm them rather than protect them. And I think about the education system, the prison industrial complex. So all of these things are happening now, and our clients are dealing with them in real time. And that changes how we think about their trauma-related difficulties. Okay, so examples where that occurs: conflict affected war zones, chronic community violence, which a lot of our clients talk about that as living in a war zone. People have been displaced by warfare and are attacked by others in the dominant group, and conditions of captivity. Okay, so I mentioned Judy Herman and Judy Herman's work in trauma recovery. And so she talks about the experience of children dealing with abuse in this way that is consistent with this idea of continuous traumatic stress. And she says the child trapped in an abusive environment is faced with formidable tasks of adaptation. She must find a way to preserve a sense of trust in people who are untrustworthy, safety in a situation that is unsafe, control in a situation that is terrifyingly unpredictable, power in a situation of helplessness. Unable to care for or protect herself, she must compensate for the failures of adult care and protection with the only means at her disposal, an immature system of psychological defenses. And we talked about this last time, but this idea that in the service of protecting the self from unbearable experiences, those who have the mental agility to do so are able to segregate various aspects of their experiences. And so I'm going to take an example now from a survivor of complex trauma. Her name is Debbie Drexler, and this is from a comic book that she wrote called Daddy's Girl, and it's about it's semi-autobiographical. And it's about how father-daughter incest shaped the experience of this family. So this is an episode that takes place after an episode of sexual abuse by her father. So this is Pearl. Mommy, someone help me, help. Now we know that children in these situations usually cannot go to their mommy or go to somebody to help them. And so she can't go to anybody. So what does she do? She takes a part of herself, splits it off from herself, and then uses it to help her manage. So it says, Lily, 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 we'll come whenever you need us. We wish we could do more, but we can't. We love you, Lily. Now go to sleep. And this is what enables Lily to survive. So she is able to sleep. It works. It also comes at a very high cost. And so what we're talking about last time, today, next time is, what does this cost people when they have to do this in order to survive, and how can we support them recovering from that? So comments or questions about that? Okay. And we talked about last time how the diagnosis of PTSD has limitations, particularly for kids. It's conceptualized from an adult perspective, was originally identified as a diagnosis for Vietnam veterans and women who had experienced sexual assault, focuses on single event traumas, fails to recognize chronic, multiple ongoing traumas, all the different kinds of complicated traumatic stress we just talked about, is not developmentally sensitive, does not reflect the impact of trauma on brain development. A lot of our kids actually don't meet the criteria for PTSD. And most important, it does not direct clinical attention to attachment history and attachment related injuries, which you were just asking about. Are we going to talk about that? And the answer is absolutely. It's really central to a lot of this. So we know that all these different kinds of complicated traumatic stress or complex trauma have profound effects on development, functioning, personality, and the capacity to live, love, and be loved, and that these effects are not accounted for in our current diagnostic classification system, nor are they addressed in standard simple PTSD treatment approaches. So standard simple PTSD treatment approaches, which often are the ones that are dictated that we must do because they are evidence-based, they're the gold standard, they've had the most publications of random controlled trials, that those are the interventions we must do. So TFCBT being the gold standard for PTSD. And unfortunately, that limits what tools we have available to us to help people with the effects of trauma that are not specific to PTSD and are not part of those interventions. So those interventions are extremely valuable and everybody should be trained in them. And we'll talk more about this in part 3, but we should not limit ourselves to using those interventions or assume that those interventions are going to be sufficient for children who've had a lifetime of all these layers of different kinds of trauma. So when we talk about complex trauma, and this comes from the work on developmental trauma disorder, we're talking about exposure to multiple forms of violence and other potentially traumatic stressors in the context of attachment behavioral systems that are unable to provide protection, care, and comfort. So the focus is on cumulative trauma and the developmental context in which exposure occurs rather than on discrete episodes of trauma. So for developmental trauma disorder, the proposed criterion A is experienced or witnessed multiple or prolonged adverse events over a period of at least 1 year, beginning in childhood or early adolescence, including number 1, direct experience or witnessing of repeated and severe episodes of interpersonal violence, and number 2, significant disruptions of protective caregiving as a result of repeated changes in primary caregiver, repeated separation from the primary caregiver, or exposure to severe and persistent emotional abuse. And those are examples of the things that cause these disruptions. There can be other causes as well. And the idea of developmental trauma disorder is that when you've had this kind of trauma experience, that it messes with all of the developmental capacities that we acquire as we are growing during our childhood and adolescence. And so young people who've experienced this kind of developmental trauma struggle with the ability to modulate, tolerate, or recover from extreme affect states, regulation of bodily functions, their capacity to know what's happening inside them, the capacity to tell other people what's happening inside them, the capacity to perceive threat, including reading of safety and danger cues, capacity for self-protection, self-soothing, the ability to initiate or sustain goal-directed behavior, that is to have a future goal and be able to make a plan for steps to take to reach that goal, the coherent self or identity, and the capacity to regulate empathic arousal. That is, how do I manage it when I'm aware that somebody else is feeling something? And we did some research looking at this diagnosis, this proposed diagnosis, and whether or not it could be applied to the kids in that were being seen in the Chicago Child Trauma Center. And so we were not assessing prospectively for this diagnosis because it didn't exist when these kids were being assessed. the proposed criteria. So we took the proposed criteria and kind of backfit them onto the assessments that had been done. And we found that none of the kids who had experienced episodic traumatic stress could meet the criteria for developmental trauma disorder. And those who had both of those parts of the criterion A were much more likely to meet the criteria than those who did not. One of the things that we looked at was the different kinds of symptoms or difficulties that are specifically related to dissociation. And so the kids who had that kind of history here, they're the DTD criterion A positive compared to the DTT criterion A negative kids. And you can see that they're, if they had that DTD exposure, they had much higher scores on the child dissociative checklist. They were more likely to be reported to have difficulty knowing and describing internal states, more likely to have avoidance or dissociation of negative painful affect, more likely to be emotionally unresponsive, more likely to have difficulty labeling and expressing feelings and internal experience. They had higher scores on the child sexual behavior inventory, and they were more likely to have self-injurious behavior. None of this is surprising, but it highlights a lot of the kinds of difficulties that are related to dissociation that might not get attended to in kind of a standard trauma assessment, and often might lead to other diagnoses that are not trauma specific. So as we've talked about, attachment is really central to complex trauma and developmental trauma. And so attachment is an evolved behavioral system that functions to promote the protection and safety of the attached person. The attachment system is activated strongly by internal and external stressors or threats. That's why it's so important in understanding trauma. And it is through a healthy attachment system or attachment system that works that we develop the capacity for emotional behavioral self-regulation as well as a coherent self. So think about a baby in the crib, and the baby in the crib gets distressed for some reason. What does the baby do? Anybody?
Cries.
Cries. Yes, the baby cries. Thank you. Why?
To call attention to them, to say I'm uncomfortable.
So they're crying for attention, and are they crying for any, like they want the police to come? Whose attention are they crying for?
Mom's attention, primary
Yes.
caregiver.
Exactly, mommy. So when the attachment behavior system gets activated by some kind of stress or threat, what that activates is proximity seeking proximity of the primary caregiver. And the primary caregiver is mommy. And this is about how we're wired. This is not about whether other people can take care of children effectively. People are going to get those mixed up. But the primary attachment figure at the biological level is the person to whom the child was physically attached for 9 months. They were actually part of their body. So that comes with a lot of hard wiring, right? So baby cries, let's say mommy, and we're talking about like a good enough-ish attachment system that's basically working to do what it needs to do. So baby cries, mommy's in the next room. What does mommy do? What happens inside mommy when baby cries?
There's the stress.
Comfortable.
Mhm.
Yes, I heard stress I heard uncomfortable. I don't know if you said stress or distress, but mommy feels bad, right? So there's the cry has a dysregulating effect on mommy. What is the purpose of that?
Get mommy to act.
Exactly. It gets mommy to get up and go to baby. Proximity seeking, right? So then she goes, and again, we're talking about good enough-ish. She goes, she what does she do?
She goes
Tries
to
to
the
meet the
baby and
baby's
sees
needs.
what they need.
She
Figures
goes to
it
the
out.
baby, tries to figure out what the baby needs. Does she do it by like pulling out her child parenting books, like how to be a good mommy? Does she like go on Google and Google like different baby cries? What do they mean? Do some research. What does
She
she do?
picks up the baby to check
Yes.
on them. Yeah.
Picks up the baby. And when she picks up the baby, what is she doing?
Trying to assess their needs.
Yep. She's trying to assess their needs. What else is she doing?
Touching.
Well,
Touching,
Soothing.
touching.
she's touching them. She's holding them. What might
Soothing.
she be doing with her body or her voice?
Rocking, comforting.
Rocking, comforting.
Soothing.
Yeah. What? Soothing. Yeah. Great. What might she be saying?
You're safe. I've got you. It's okay.
Beautiful.
It's
Yep.
okay.
Reassuring, right? Like comforting. It's going to be okay, right? All those things. There's another important thing that she's going to do with her words and her voice.
She's going to model calm.
Yes.
She's
Yes.
not going to like shout, calm down. She's
Right.
going to like show it with how she's regulating herself, like being calm.
Yep. So even the way, the kind of voice she's using, the tones in her voice, all of that, what she's doing with her body, great. And another thing she's going to do that's really important is she's going to try to use language to describe what might be happening inside baby. She's going to try to put words to baby's experience. So it might be, oh, you got scared, right? Or, oh, your diaper's wet, you felt uncomfortable, whatever. She's going to use words to make sense of what's happening inside baby. And so she does all this stuff and she hasn't even solved the problem yet, right? Like she hasn't done the intervention, whatever that is. Like she hasn't fed baby or changed baby or gotten baby out of that room or whatever it is. Even before that, she's already in many ways taken care of the problem, right? So you have whatever happens, a stressor, a threat, and that dysregulates baby. Baby, because baby's dysregulated, does this thing to dysregulate mommy. They're both dysregulated. They come together. They do this thing together. And now they both feel better.
I think you're assuming that the mother can regulate herself. And
right. So remember, I said good enough-ish, right? So that's if we're really lucky that we got a good enough-ish attachment behavioral system. So you're absolutely right that when mommy is not able to self-regulate, right, then that prevents this system from working the way it was intended to work, right? But when it's good enough-ish, that is how we develop the capacity for emotional and behavioral self-regulation, as well as the coherent self. Now, the comment you made is extremely important because when one doesn't have this experience in their own infancy and childhood, one is not going to have a working attachment behavioral system when baby comes along, right? So this is one of the ways that intergenerational transmission of trauma occurs. This is how trauma gets passed from one generation to the next, right? Is through these traumatized attachment behavioral systems. Fortunately, we have interventions like child parent psychotherapy that are designed to heal the attachment. So the other thing we got from our attachment theorists is this idea of internal working models. And those are complementary representations of the self and the attachment figure. And so these are basically our idea about who and what we are and who and what other people are. What are people for? What are relationships for, etc. And these models reflect the child's appraisal of and confidence in the self as acceptable and worthy of care and protection, and the attachment figure's desire, ability, and availability to provide protection and care. And so for many of our young people who've had attachment disruptions or attachment behavior systems that could not provide protection, care, and comfort, at the core for them is the belief that they are not worthy of care and protection. And so this is true from their experience in their individual attachment relationships. And also it's true for the messages that they get from systems about their worth and whether they are worthy of care and protection. And so for a lot of the young people we serve, it's both of those that are giving them messages that they're not worthy. So this is the work of Giovanni Liotti, who this is a classic paper about dissociation and disorganized attachment. And so what he says is in disorganized attachment that children construe what they've repeatedly experienced in one of these 5 different ways. So they're responsible for the fear and or aggression they perceive in the attachment figure when they approach him or her. The attachment figure being the cause of their extreme experience of fear. The attachment figure being able to comfort them. They're being able to comfort the attachment figure, or both victims of some unseen, inexplicable outside danger. And actually, they may experience all of these different things in their attachment relationships. And so this idea that they're able to comfort the attachment figure for so many kids from disorganized attachments, they are almost wired to pay more attention to regulating the adults in their life, or trying to regulate the adults in their life, than they are to themselves. So you often see this kind of pseudo maturity or parentification or whatever you want to call it. But that's one that can be really important. So the idea here is that people then kind of alternate in these different ways of being. So there's the frightened and helpless victim. There's the cause of others' fear and helplessness being the persecutor. And then there's comforting the frightened other being the rescuer. And when we are in relationships with people who've come up this way, we are pulled into these different roles, right? So if they're in the victim, we're the persecutor or we're the rescuer. So we can find ourselves being pulled into playing one of these roles, and that is usually not terribly helpful. And for many of us who go into this line of work, we're really susceptible to being this rescuer or savior, which again is not often helpful. Okay, so we're gonna skip this. Okay, so we talked last time about this theory of structural dissociation of the personality, that is where after trauma, if integration doesn't occur, we alternate between functioning as if the trauma is ongoing and functioning as if it never occurred. In this theory of trauma-related structural dissociation of the personality, the part of the personality that is functioning as if the trauma is constantly occurring is referred to as the emotional part of the personality. And the part that's functioning as if the trauma never occurred is referred to as the apparently normal part of the personality. And when you have that primary structural dissociation of some traumatic experience, what you get is acute stress disorder, persistent trauma-related distress, simple PTSD. When you have within the different kinds of trauma that get split off, when you have additional kinds of splits within that emotional part of the personality, that is where you get to complex PTSD, developmental trauma disorder. They call that secondary structural dissociation. And then tertiary structural dissociation is when you have splits in the emotional part of the personality and in the apparently normal part of the personality. And that is where you get dissociative identity disorder, or, the dissociative disorder is not otherwise specified. They could fit somewhere in between that secondary and tertiary. So I'm looking at our time, and I think I'm trying to decide, do we do the video and the discussion of the video today? And I think we should. So I'm going to just very quickly go through these. These are when we were working on dissociative disorders for the DSM-5, these were the proposed child dissociative diagnoses along this continuum. So you have simple PTSD with dissociative features. And so they would have PTSD and also characterized by transient dissociative episodes triggered by trauma-related stimuli. And then in this group, one can usually identify the triggers and their relationship to the trauma. It gets more complicated the more complex the trauma is and the more complex the presentations are. During these episodes, children may exhibit, for example, any of the following: staring blankly, unresponsiveness to external stimuli, falling asleep or becoming very drowsy, marked regression, inability to take in or remember new information, intense focus on internal stimuli. They can generally be brought back to the present by reassurance that they are safe, the presence of a safe attachment figure, or reminders that the trauma is no longer occurring. They have difficulty accessing emotions associated with the trauma, and the internalized experience or memory of the trauma may be characterized by a sense of depersonalization or derealization. but these children don't tend to experience depersonalization or derealization in response to non-trauma related events. That is now what they would say in the DSM-5 is the dissociative subtype of PTSD. As I said last time, they got it backwards. PTSD is a subtype of dissociative disorder, not that there's a dissociative subtype of PTSD. So at that secondary dissociation level, you have everything we just talked about, plus in comparison to those children, transient dissociative episodes in these children are prolonged, triggers are less easily identified, and it is more difficult to bring them back to the present when the episodes occur. These children are often characterized as spaced out, fantasy prone, or forgetful, and they're characterized by rigid object relations and tend to alternate among three roles: the victim, persecutor, and rescuer. Not only do these children have difficulty accessing emotions associated with the trauma, they may have split off entire affects. For example, they're never angry or never sad. Behavioral symptoms may include memory disturbance, as evidenced by difficulty remembering whether or not they did something, inability to remember brief periods of time, losing time, etc. Somatoform dissociative symptoms, for example, inability to feel certain parts of their body, inability to feel pain, problems with emotional and behavioral self-regulation, for example, unprovoked outbursts of anger or sobbing, physical or sexual aggression, sleepwalking, excessive masturbation. And then for that tertiary structural dissociation, I think I'm just going to give you this very quick story about this kid, Gabriella, who was abused at age 10 by an aunt and aunt's boyfriend. One incident, it absolutely happened. They were convicted, sentenced to long time in prison for abusing multiple kids. This kid participated in what we then used to call a victim-sensitive interview, and then apparently effective short-term abuse-focused therapy, which people usually call TFCBT, at the Children's Advocacy Center when she was 10. When she was 16, she disclosed sexual abuse by a male cousin 6 years older from the age of 6 to the age of 10. So it was going on at the time that this other abuse occurred, and she was interviewed and didn't disclose it. So she came back to the Children's Advocacy Center for services. She was assessed and appeared to have simple PTSD, except for the fact that she reported having no memory of having been in a previous therapy at the same place. She was an academic overachiever, highly conflictual relationship with mother, who also had an extensive history of childhood sexual abuse, minimal contact with father. In treatment, she identifies different parts of the self: the everyday self, angry self, happy self, and the sad, depressed self. Has numerous discussions with therapists about sex, dating boys, and the fact that she's not sexually active, is not interested in being sexually active. In a subsequent session, she casually mentions her boyfriend with whom she's been sexually active, and she's surprised that her therapist did not know about the boyfriend, has no memory of her prior statements to the therapist about not wanting to have sex. So does that kid have a dissociative identity disorder? Maybe. So for this tertiary structural dissociation, these children generally do not have sufficiently developed personalities to warrant a diagnosis of DID. In most cases, the distinct ego states exhibited are not necessarily associated with consistent identities. The divisions between different aspects or parts of the self are less rigid than those in adults with DID, and some information may be shared among parts more readily than in older individuals. They meet the criteria from the other categories, and all the symptoms are likely to occur more frequently, last longer, and occur across all domains, situations in which children function. And some examples of other symptoms include losing extended periods of time, amnesia, not recognizing self, talking to self, calling self by different names, referring to self in the third person, highly fragmentary autobiographical memory, chronic sense of depersonalization or derealization, auditory hallucinations, internal world, people by numerous characters, extended periods of regression, extended periods of functioning at developmental levels significantly higher than chronological development. One thing I'll say about the auditory hallucinations, voices are reported more frequently by people with dissociative disorders than any other symptom. So in a lot of settings, if kids disclose voices, they're automatically presumed to be psychotic, and they'll get a psychosis related diagnosis. And that is really problematic. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to watch this video, and then we'll have a few minutes for some discussion, and we can actually continue this discussion next time, and that will lead into our talking about treatment and how when we start treatment, we start with assessment and what that assessment process could look like. So I'm gonna play the video, and Sarah, you'll tell me if there's any problem, right?
Hey, she doesn't want to talk to you, man. She doesn't want to talk to you back. Oh my God! No! No! Stop it! Dude! Get off her! Leave me alone, man! Get off! Stop it!
I don't understand what you were thinking. Tell me exactly what happened.
Nothing.
Nothing? Doesn't look like nothing. You know I have to submit a report to the judge.
Who are you texting?
Texting a friend. What do you care?
Let me see your phone.
I'm not gonna let you see my phone. It's my phone.
I don't want to violate you, Manny, but this doesn't look good. What were you thinking?
Yo, Mario, what's up?
Come here.
Hey, man, why don't you leave her alone?
I was thinking, I gotta do something.
Well, you sure did something.
Hey, she doesn't want to talk to you, man. She doesn't want to talk to you, man.
What are you gonna do about it, huh?
Get back.
Oh my God! No! Stop it!
Dude! Get off her! Leave me alone, man! Get off!
No! Stop it! Stop it!
Are you using again?
No.
Is that what your drug test is going to tell me?
Yes.
I've known you for a while, and I believe you're a good kid, but your anger could be your undoing. So you've got to do something about that.
It's not as bad as it looks.
You told me this wouldn't happen again.
I know.
Did you get busted again?
No, it's all good. Don't worry about it, babe.
I told you. I don't want my baby around anyone who's violent.
It was just something stupid. I don't even know what happened. I would never hurt our baby.
How am I supposed to trust you? You just broke the one promise you made me. You know I don't want him to grow up with parents like ours.
What are you talking about? You had it easier than I did.
I'm serious.
I'm sorry. Look, all I'm saying is that I'm not like your old man, okay? I can be in control. Can I hold my baby now, please?
Go clean yourself up. I don't want blood on our baby.
Manny, bring out a new diaper when you're done.
Manny! Give me some water! Hear me talking to you, boy? I said give me some water! Hurry up!
Manny, diapers, please.
Don't make me get up! Hurry up! It's always something with you, you stupid! You retard! It's always something with you, I don't want that kid anyways, I fucking told you!
Manny, did you hear me?
Hey, bud. Seems like you've been having a hard time. Do you want to talk about why you've been getting in fights? Not getting along with the other kids in your class?
How's school, Manny? Good. It was good. Did you do anything fun? No. Is that boy still picking on you? No. Good. Did you tell him who's boss? Manny, wait up! You have to stay close.
Manny! Manny! What's up, man? What's good, bro?
Those boys are idiots. Don't hang out with them.
Also, I've heard that you've been having trouble paying attention. Focusing on your work? Would you be willing to tell me what's bothering you?
Hey, what's good, Manny? What's going on, my man? How's it going? How you doing, man?
Leave my brother alone.
Hey, girl, how you doing? Where you? How you doing? Yeah, where you going, huh? Hanging out with my boy Nick.
Manny. Manny. Manny, you're not in trouble, okay? I just want to know what's going on.
Fuck off! What the hell?
Where you going, huh? Where you going?
What's up? Oh my god! Manny!
Hello? Oh, hi. Yes, thank you so much for getting back to me. Yeah, so the reason we're recommending testing is we're kind of confused with what's going on. I mean, he's such a sweet kid, but he just seems to be having so much difficulty functioning. Yeah. Okay, I mean, he is hyperactive. His teacher keeps coming to me and, telling me about all of his learning problems. She seems to think that he has ADHD. But, at other times, he just seems to go off into another world. I'm just starting to wonder if it's maybe something developmentally. Yeah, but I mean, then there's other times when he just explodes and gets aggressive. I'm just starting to think that maybe given his family history that it may be some form of bipolar. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to get back to me. I hope this helps inform your testing. Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Look, I know you love your kid, and that's a beautiful thing. But you have to start working on making better choices if you want to keep on being the man of your house. And that's real talk.
I shouldn't even try anymore. Maybe they're better off without me. I'm just gonna screw up like I have my whole life.
Maybe you will, and maybe you won't. But you owe it to your son to try. He's going to be your age one day. And what do you want him to think when he looks back and remembers his dad?
I don't know what's wrong with me. I get really angry sometimes and nothing can calm me down. I don't want to be this way. I have a beautiful girlfriend and a son at home who I love. I just want to protect them from everything. And I've heard it all. I have conduct disorder. I have bipolar disorder. There's probably not much you can do to help me anyways. But people keep asking me what I'm gonna do about it. And I don't know. I don't know what I'm gonna do about it because I can't get any help anywhere. And I've tried all the different meds. And the fact is that they just kind of numb me out, but they don't really help me get over anything.
Manny, we're gonna do our best to make therapy different this time. I'm interested in what happened to you as a child and helping you understand that there can be a connection between that and all these behaviors you've had and you getting all these labels over the years. You know, when a child grows up in a house like you did, oftentimes they come up with ways of dealing with things to help them survive and cope with all that's happened before. I want us to understand together the connections between your behaviors and reactions, the difficult things you've lived through, and why you may be behaving and acting in these ways. If it's okay with you, I want us to work together to see what we're gonna do about this.
I'm sorry for breaking my promise. I'm gonna work on getting better, okay?
You gotta think about your life, Manny. Think about all the good things you've accomplished. Just work on making a better life for our son.
I love you.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left. And so I'd like folks to think about these questions. So how and to whom has diagnosis been helpful or harmful, including Manny? So think about When is diagnosis helpful? When is it unhelpful or harmful? And then I want you to think about, have you worked with clients like Manny? What diagnosis did they have? How did their diagnoses inform your work with them? Where would you start with Manny? How would you approach assessment? How could a diagnosis be helpful to Manny? What would you most want to know in working with him? And I think what we'll do next time is start off with thinking about these questions and having some time for discussion of them. And then we'll move into how we approach intervention, including assessment. But any thoughts in the last couple of minutes about anything we talked about today, including the film and these questions?
I have a comment.
Yes.
I'm touched by kids like Manny, and I think everything you're saying today, that just tells me how strong resiliency in the human spirit is. In the midst of Manny, probably suicidal, could have jumped off that effing bridge, ready to get set to punch someone's daylights out. He comes back. So I'm intrigued by the hope of finding ways to listen and metabolize all that stuff they went through, we all go through. So I'm hopeful, but I know there's enough work for all of us until the day we die. And I appreciate the video.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. It's all, I'm sure everybody here can relate to everything you just said. And that is the thing about our clients, is that they're amazing. And they're incredibly resilient, they're incredibly strong, and they have a lot of trouble. And so if we can help them figure out how to use their strengths and their resilience to manage themselves so that they can manage the rest of the world that's so screwed up, then we're getting somewhere.
Can I ask a question? But it actually goes back to that picture that Lily drew like a while ago. I was thinking about it. I mean, about that girl, and then they had Lily. They had her as 3 people, kind of like almost a resource team that she disassociated into. Is that how you would, is that what disassociate? I was always under the impression disassociation was more of like a shutdown, but that picture almost made it like it's a loving resource that you kind of go to.
So the way to think about it is less about how it looks on the surface, right? Like what behavior you're seeing or what symptom you're seeing, and more about what has been dissociated, what has been split off. And so there are parts of her that do feel loved and that do have hope, right? And what her trauma has done is, because those parts are so tied up with the source of the trauma, right, that they're associated with the trauma and they're split off, and they're splitting them off. They're not completely gone, and there are ways that those parts actually can help her to function in the way that's illustrated there. But there's also, with that, splitting off often, like the ability to feel, right? And for her, even, the ability to feel herself as this lovable person. Does that help at all? to answer the question you're asking?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I guess for me, the clarity I was sort of looking for, which maybe I just didn't understand what you said, is that I always thought dissociation was kind of like more of like an isolating negative that had a purpose, but it was more of like an isolating negative. And her portrayal of it in that picture was more of this like warm, loving environment. And I guess that's what I was like, huh, like I never thought of it that way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what happens when there's trauma and fear mixed up with love, right? Is that mixed up with love and attachment, is that the love becomes part of the traumatic material that needs to be dissociated.
Gotcha.
And that's why betrayal trauma is so harmful to people, right? Because the people that are harming you are also the people that you love. Laurie Kahn, who's a therapist on the North Shore, she's got a program called Women Care Counseling. I don't know if you're familiar with Women Care, but Laurie Kahn wrote a book called Baffled by Love that is really all about this and about the fact that Laurie's work has been really helpful in addressing the fact that we as clinicians often don't want to talk about love, or we're taught that we're not supposed to talk about love. And what she's saying is actually for many of our clients, love, their experience of love is central to their difficulties. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah.
And check out Laurie's book too. So I think we are out of time, or actually over time. Sarah, is there anything you need to say before folks leave?
Thanks for joining, and see you March 3rd.
Well, that was succinct, Sarah.
Actually, don't shut us off yet, because I want to read the comments in the chat now.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
If you do have to go, you can. If you want to stay.
Yeah, if you want to stay and you have
Dr. Stolbach is here.
I'm here. I'm going to read the chat, and if you have other things you want to talk about, I can.
Could I ask you another question?
Sure.
I'm just wondering if there's a distinction between disassociation, that when a person disassociates, they leave their body, as opposed to ego states that are that are parts of the body, and that they're inside us, and that we might use real, our own ego states or parts of ourselves to help heal the disassociation and consolidate us. Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm not sure if I got everything you said. So you're saying that, tell me again the distinction you're making between the parts that are outside and the parts that
I think the parts inside of ourselves are parts of our inside us. Okay, so I might say, even simply like, on one hand, I'd like to do this, and on the other hand, the other part of me wants to do this, but I might have a nurturer and a protector and a scared child inside me, but they're inside me. Okay, they're parts of me. And when we dissociate, that we usually leave our body in order to cope, okay? Because there's trauma going around, we need to leave. So I think that is a good distinction. And then we can, in order to heal the dissociation when we need to leave, is to use our internal, ego states, or to be able to, heal so that we don't have to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's right. And the kind of dissociation that was illustrated in the comic, and that is that out of body, or really that depersonalization, that kind of like, this is not me, I'm over here. That's one kind of dissociation. It's not the only kind. Like, there's all different kinds, and that ultimately what we're trying to do is make it possible for people to be able to feel, or be able to be aware of, these different states, these different parts, these different experiences at the same time, right? So I can feel that these are all different parts of me, and that I can have access to one way of being at the same time that I'm feeling a different kind of way.
Are you saying that's disassociation, or you're saying
That's the goal. That's ultimately the goal, is so that people have access to all the different parts of themselves that they may need to dissociate because of trauma. Did that make it worse, or did that?
I mean, maybe next week when we talk about your, treatment, maybe then I'll understand what you said more.
So, I mean, the bottom line of what I'm saying is the goal is always integration.
Correct.
Right. So,
yes.
That includes parts that may have been dissociated in the way that you're talking about, where it's like there's this outside of me part, and then there are all these parts inside me that I also can't feel, or if I feel one of them, or if I'm aware of one of them, then I can't be aware of all the others. And our goal is to try to make it so that people can easily access different parts, different states, different ways of being, or move seamlessly from one to another.
Got it. Okay, so you're saying that there is dissociation can be internal. It's when the different the parts or the ego states cannot communicate with each other and are not aware of each other, and that is also dissociation.
Yep.
Okay, and you want to consolidate the whole being.
Yep.
I mean, we will still have parts, but they'll be able to communicate and access, and we'll feel them in our bodies, things like that.
Right. And where people run into trouble, or have run into trouble with interventions for dissociative patients, it usually is when their treatment is supporting the separateness.
That makes sense.
So making these different parts as though they are actually different people, approaching them that way, supporting that way of experiencing them and thinking about them.
Got it.
And so it's if you lose the as if, right, in your work with people, then you're actually supporting the dissociation and maybe even exacerbating it.
Right. I guess it's important. That's why before you do this work, there needs to be a dissociative assessment, because it's so easy to not know for a long time that there is, dissociation there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. Anybody else?
I have one question educationally. So I'm new and I'm totally loving trauma. Loving it in a way that you all love it, but loving it, trauma, the dissociation. I've been reading a ton of stuff. I'm trying to find a good resource, class, something on parts. Is there anyone that you like? I'm a beginner, so I don't need something that's like crazy advanced, but I definitely have I have complex trauma patients who I did not even realize they were, and now their parts are showing up and all over, and I didn't even really know they existed. You know, like it's all coming out. And so I'm just trying to learn as efficiently, but also as quickly, I guess, as I can to be able to help her. Do you have any recommendations? Short-term and long-term?
So the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation has a interest group on the North Shore. That one thing to do would be to try to connect with those folks. I mean, they need joining the ISSTD. I think you have to be a member. Around here, there's Dick Schwartz internal family systems work that a lot of people find to be a very helpful approach. In terms of other, books, I would say The Child Survivor by Joyce Silberg is where I would start.
Child Survivor by who?
Joy Silberg.
Joyce Silberg.
And there's a lot of good work that's been done on somatic approaches to therapy. If you you can kind of follow Bessel van der Kolk, like follow him on social media or something like that, and then just see what piques your interest.
Okay. It's just a huge topic. Every time I go to one, I get lost to another one. I'm like, well, I want to learn this and this and this. I'm like, need to figure out what the best thing is to learn.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're talking about working with children, I would start with Joy's book, and then I would go from there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I have a question. It's more theoretical, but
well, I don't like that kind of stuff. So.
Okay,
Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I recently went to a workshop with Dr. Richard Shavitz. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yes, I know. Yeah, I know Rich.
And we got into a really brief discussion about repression or suppression, suppression either. And he was just talking about how that has been refuted time again, over and over again by the trauma dissociative community. And I was just wondering your thoughts about, it was a brief discussion and it really caught my eye because I think there's always this discussion about repressed memories, and you hear this like recovered, repressed, and I've always had a personal reaction, like not fully, there's not much research to support that. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts in light of this dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, so is your question about whether repressed, recovered memories are like a real thing?
Yeah.
Or whether they're whether there's a difference between repression and dissociation.
Yeah, I think it's just this large sort of a topic that I've been thinking about, but when I pull up research articles, there's a lot of discussion around that there's really not much evidence to support repression, repressed memories. And then some articles populate around it that guides us to dissociative, and that the dissociative route is a much more practical and understandable route to understand what happens.
So, I mean, a lot of this, I think, goes back to what they called the memory wars, which were, in the 80s and 90s, and people were in these different camps. That one that said repressed memories, we should believe them all. Recovered memories, and the other side of the camp said, there's no such thing, it's bullshit, right? It's therapists convincing their clients that. Repression is a defense mechanism that Freud described, right? That we all do. Like we repress stuff. And that's one of the ways that we deal with stuff that we don't want to deal with, right? So repression is a real thing. Amnesia is a real thing. These are both real things. Access to things that have been repressed or forgotten is also real. Are there instances where people think that they remember things that never actually happened? Yes, that's real too. Like I've had a dream and then not known, was that a dream or was that like, I don't know. Or maybe it got turned into a memory, you know, but actually it didn't happen in real life. So that can happen. So it's all very complicated. And I think where we can run into trouble is confusing the pursuit of criminal justice or civil justice with the work of psychotherapy. So, but I mean, if you have had any trauma in your life, or if you've had a loved one who's had any trauma in their life, you know that there's stuff that they don't know that happened to them, that they've forgotten, or that they can't access. But then at times they do know. So it's real. Like nobody can say it's not real because it's like, I mean, it's sort of like this, I don't know. And people who get caught up in that, trying to disprove things that clearly exist and everybody knows exist, like that's why they do this with complex PTSD. I mean, a few years ago, in the process of the DSM-5 and the ICD-11 work, there was a presentation at the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies. Mary Lynn Cloytra got up and gave the update on the work of the complex PTSD group that was working on complex PTSD for the ICD-11 and presented all the evidence that they had and what the different diagnoses were going to look like, etc. And it was one of a set of presentations in a symposium. And the discussant for the symposium was actually Mary Lynn's boss at the National Center for PTSD, and Matt Friedman. And so he was the discussant, and he got up after this and said, there's no evidence for complex PTSD. What is the purpose of that? I don't know. I still don't know. But we have clients for whom this is their life, and it's helpful to them when they can understand that they're not crazy. So anyway, it's a good question, but it's very complicated, and people like Rich, like he's been in this work a lot longer than me. Like he's in that, like he's got people making death threats and stuff. So for him to say, we're done with that, like I think that's fair.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely don't want to mischaracterize that conversation we had in the workshop, but I think he was referring to partly too is that practically speaking, the dissociative framework is a much more accessible and workable frame for therapy, for the therapeutic relationship. This is my interpretation of the discussion, and then sort of adhering to some other psychic process. He did. I think that was part of
yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of how I approach trauma, is like saying that this is central to all of it. And if we, you know, if we think about how dissociation works, and we understand the peritraumatic dissociation and what that does, and then how it operates ongoing, and how that creates PTSD or complex PTSD or whatever, and maintains it, then that's a lot more useful than saying, you know, this is like an anxiety disorder or something.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Oh, do you want to go, Felix? Did you just raise your hand?
Yeah, but I just wanted to just mention something that maybe could be talked about in the next one, the next training. So you go ahead.
That's the same. I had a quick question. I'm wondering if you were going to talk about this next time. I was curious. I was thinking about the role of technology, particularly as sort of an agent of dissociation and escapism. So I guess I'm curious to know if there's been any research around that, or if you were going to talk about it at all.
I'm not, because I don't really know anything about it, but I'm curious say more about what you mean.
I'm thinking about a client, it's actually not even my client, but I am aware that this child client who has really complex trauma spends a very large amount of time on video games, texting, like connecting socially, and likely inappropriately, and becomes very dysregulated when asked to stop. Will refuse to go to school, will refuse sometimes to go to therapy, even though he likes therapy. So I guess I feel like this is probably a growing area for children who are experiencing complex trauma in a time of extreme interconnectedness over technology.
And I think it's actually a good example of how these are things that are issues for many people who are traumatized, people who have other difficulties, right? Like this addiction to gaming, or, you know, even like I have a 17-year-old who he could game for, 48 hours nonstop if he was allowed, probably. But how do you kind of disentangle what is about trauma-related triggered dysregulation, and what is about developmental stuff, and what is about just, the way people use these things to manage themselves. And so I think trying to understand it in the context of the trauma and what is being triggered and what is being avoided. And then, I mean, my other kid is 21-year-old autistic kid, and their entire social life now is on Twitter. Like that's like that, almost like finding a Twitter community pretty much like saved their life, because now they have social connection, right? So it's, it's complicated, like everything that we're talking about. But does it exacerbate dissociative difficulties? Potentially, yes.
Yeah, I feel like it's a place where kids can feel really regulated.
Definitely.
I feel like sometimes.
Definitely. Or adults, you know.
Adults too, right.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. So the thing that I'm thinking about is continuous traumatic stress, and how I'm wondering if in the next training you can talk a little bit about how to do the work of defining the likelihood of a threat, you know, because, you know, as clinicians, we're going to be positioned differently with our identities than our clients, and like our understanding of how likely it is that the threat of the traumatic event happening again could be different than our clients, right? So we have to have some careful discussions around, you know, that likelihood, and I'm wondering if we can get into that a little bit.
So I think yes, and probably not enough, right? So but if you could bring that question back next time when we're talking about sort of in the beginning, how do we try to understand our clients' trauma histories and what they've been through and what they're dealing with now, and how do we gather that information, try to get an understanding of that. I think that's an important piece of it, that it's much easier for us to just say, like, did this happen to you in the past? And to not want to really account for the things that are happening still and now, because it feels terrible. It's like, it's very demoralizing.
Yeah, especially if they can tell that part of our different assessment of the risk level comes from a different identity.
Yep.
I'll bring it up.
But
thank you.
all those things are things, depending on their developmental level, that we can talk to them about and use in a way that could be helpful. Yeah. All right. So fortunately for all of us, like, I did not have an 11 o'clock appointment today, so this worked out, and I you know, this is fun for me. So now I have to go do stuff that's not fun. But I appreciate you sticking around, and appreciate your interest in this. And we should probably stop, Sarah, I'm thinking.
Okay. See everybody on March 3rd.
Thank you so
All right.
much for the extra time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Take care.